I take care of myself and take the Senolytics, can I delay my menopause, for example, or extend my fertility? Because all of a sudden that's all connected to mitochondria, and there would be some sort of connection with extending fertility for women.
She'd had 5 different women, plus herself, that had all started menstruating again after doing Qualia Senolytic for a bit of time. So these were people that had relatively recently gone into menopause and stopped menstruating.
Hi, my name is Aggie, and this is Biohacking Bestie. The one-stop shop for a modern queen, where you can find biohacking courses, self-growth courses, and where you can find the most incredible community of women so you can hit all of your biohacking goals and beyond.
Dr. Kelly, I'm so happy that we are connecting finally, especially that I have been using your product for quite some time. It's nice to put a face behind a product.
Oh, thank you.
I'm so excited to talk about aging. I think as women, all we hear about growing up is like, we're like almost scared of aging, right? Like it's just like as soon as we're 20 years old, we're being told that it's good to use Botox preventatively. So, just in case. And it's just this like dark cloud over our heads every single day. And from one hand, I think it's beautiful to embrace getting older, because it's a beautiful process, and it makes it, it's a privilege. But from the other, there's so many things we can do that our health span and our joy span last for as long as possible. So let's just figure like, why do we age and why we don't have to?
Yeah, so I think at least there's 2 main camps of theories of aging, and I don't think of them as mutually exclusive, but one would be we age because of the accumulation of damage in our cells and tissues. And the other would be more that it's almost like we're programmed to age, right? So evolutionarily speaking, our genes want to reproduce themselves. And once they've done that, there's not as much reason to keep us around. So that would be more this idea of programmed aging. And then there's a lot of theories that slot into one or the other. And I think often things fit into both. So we're going to talk a lot more, I think, today about senescent cells and Senolytics. And I think of senescent cells as something that clearly is in the damage accumulation world, like they're damaged cells in a realistic way. But there's also some evidence that we might make more of them in a programmed aging sort of way as we get older. So maybe they play in both worlds.
Wow, beautiful. Okay, so women that listen to my podcast are just starting to biohack. And I once read one of the reviews about the podcast. I'm like, don't be scared about this scary word biohacking. It's actually quite easy to listen to all the guests. And it is funny that like some people feel super intimidated. You just used a somewhat difficult word, senescent cells, and a lot of people maybe don't get exposed to even that term. So let's, in very simple terms, what are senescent cells?
So senescent is and senescence comes from the same word as senile, right? Like the root, it has to do with aging, right? Sen, S-E-N. And think of them as just a really specific type of stressed cell. So what would happen is, like your listeners know, like we want the right amount of stress, right? We don't want no stress. We don't want too much stress. And when we get stressed as a whole human being, then we want resilience, right? We want to respond in a healthy way to that. So cells also get stressed by a lot of the same things that stress you and I out, right? Like, poor nutrition, ionizing radiation, you name it, chemical stress, like toxicity, you name it. And when a cell gets stressed, it has a couple main choices of how to respond. One is it can say, okay, like, I got this. I'm resilient. I'm just going to beef up my antioxidant defenses, challenge accepted, and we're good. Another, like if maybe the stress is too much for it to be resilient, it will take some damage on. So, and damage inside cells usually has to do with mucking up proteins, right? Like things tangling up. Okay. Mitochondria, I don't know if your audience would know that term, like mitochondria, which are our powerhouses. Yeah, like those becoming dysfunctional. And so then like the next choice would be, okay, I took some damage on, let me fix that. I'll repair. I'll fix the DNA, I'll clean up the mitochondria. I'll do something called autophagy that helps gobble up and recycle proteins that have been gunked up. But if the stress was even more than that, then a cell's either going to die or it's going to become so severely damaged that it's not going to be allowed to make more copies of itself. And a senescent cell is that last category. It's an unrepairable cell, often because of stress. Sometimes just that cell is old, right? Cells age; they have life cycles just like us. But it figured out how not to die. So like the visual for your listeners would be, think of a vibrant green plant, right? So all the leaves super healthy. And now for some reason that plant gets stressed, maybe too little water, too much water, poor soil, stress. Yeah. And one or two leaves start to yellow, right? So those yellowing leaves should fall off the plant, right? And our stress cells should literally fall off of our tissues. So the word for that, and this is another sciencey word, so sorry to the listeners, but it's called apoptosis. But just remember it comes from a Greek word that means literally falling off, in the same sense of a fruit falling off a tree or a leaf falling off the branch. So what would happen in that plant if that leaf didn't fall off? What would happen if you left that yellow leaf alone on the plant?
I mean, it's going to start rotting.
Right, like it's going to be sucking up nutrition that you'd want to go to healthy leaves. And then often what happens is one yellow leaf now attracts pests, and they cause other nearby leaves to be infected with the same pests. And so now you have kind of spreading of yellow leaves. And before long, the whole plant struggles. So what a gardener does is comes along periodically and prunes off the yellow leaves, right? And then that helps, free up nutrition, supports new growth. So it's kind of the same in our tissues. When you think of what are senescent cells? Yeah, they're stress cells. They're like the yellow leaves of our tissues that we need to prune away, or if left on their own, they're going to start to suck up a lot of nutrition and start to cause dysfunction to spread to other cells that were nearby but otherwise healthy.
And I understand that our bodies are built to get rid of those yellow leaves of our tree, but over time, would you say that because there are too many yellow leaves, or our ability to get rid of them becomes hindered, and that's why it feels like we're aging, or some people are aging faster than others?
So I think it's a little bit of both. So the backup plan always is the immune system. Like for any stress cell, if that cell, like in this case, didn't fall off the plant, then the gardener, the pruner, should be the immune system. It should surveil and find stress cells and then gobble them up and then recycle the debris so it can be put back to create brand new healthy cells. And as we get older, one of the things that's really been well known for a long time is our immune system starts to struggle. It becomes old and it doesn't do as good a job at finding all kinds of stress cells. It's why many immune kind of things affect older people more than they do younger people. And so that's part of the reason. More just get missed that should have been found by the immune system. I mentioned the programmed aging piece. More just get made as we get older compared to when we're younger. So one of the animal studies that I remember reading, and I loved the description the authors made when they were talking about it, but they basically said, in young animals, when we exposed them to this stress, they created some senescent cells. But in the old animals, it was like an explosion of senescent cells got caused. So that's the second reason. We just make more as we get older. And then the last thing is why senescent cells are sometimes called zombie cells. So part of that is because they don't die, right? They're hanging out. They're not making new cells, so they're not like live, but they haven't gone through cell death. But the other reason is because senescent cells can put compounds into the environment around them that can fundamentally zombify other cells. They can turn healthy cells into senescent cells. So think of it almost like as a snowball rolling downhill. Because of those three reasons, it doesn't just gradually get worse and worse. It gets worse and worse, but almost like a exponential increase over time if we're not doing something to remove senescent cells.
And that's also, it feels like they just have bad influence on everyone around them. It's like that kind of friend that isn't, makes you have really bad habits. And so what would be the hallmarks of aging? If we can just take a step back and kind of help people understand what is.
So we know, like with aging, right? So there's lots of health things that come up with aging, right? Like we're much more likely to have, heart disease and cancer and cognitive issues and all kinds of things. And what the hallmarks of aging is stepping back and trying to understand why. Like, what are the common things that happen in aging on a more cellular level that might then contribute to all these different problems that show up, right? Whether it's our muscles getting weaker, our skin getting saggy, or one of these more disease states. So scientists originally around 10 years ago got together and decided, okay, well, there's these 9 things on a cellular level that all organisms seem to have in common as they age. So humans, monkeys, mice, you go back. And these are things like, the mitochondrial dysfunction, right? So mitochondria performing less well as we get older. Another one, is senescent cells, that these stress cells accumulate. A third has to do with something called telomeres, right, which are the end caps on our cells. Like those, each time a cell replicates itself, that chain gets smaller and smaller, and at some point that causes a damage response in cells. DNA damage would be a fourth. So anyways, they came up with, okay, we have this 9. And then more recently, about a year and a half ago, they added 3 more to the list. So right now there's 12 hallmarks of aging. And the 3 new ones, one of them was dysbiosis, which is basically just think of our GI, the organisms that live there, and the job they do just gets worse as we get older, right? So that became a new one. Another new one had to do with inflammation, right? And we've known for a long time that as people get older, they tend to have like a low level chronic inflammation that contributes to a lot of issues.
Wouldn't you say, and I might be wrong because I'm not a doctor, but wouldn't you say that like a lot of time in your body's working perfectly fine, and then the slower the mitochondria is, the more overwhelmed, then immune system isn't as good, so it's more inflammation. It's almost like catch-22, but the more inflammation there is, the mitochondria isn't performing properly. So it just feels like it's a really hard loop to get out of as you get older.
Yeah, I tend to think of the idea of like there's vicious cycles and virtuous cycles in most things, right? And often with aging, there's a lot of vicious cycles that go on, and that's one, right? That and then think of our good habits, like right now you're walking, right? Like you're doing a virtuous cycle, right? Like, building good things into your life. So, it's hard
though, because it's like, I really struggle doing these interviews because I have, when I have a whole day and I'm doing meetings, my first thought is like, oh my God, people are going to think I'm a weirdo, or like I'm trying too hard, or, I don't want you to think of me that I'm weird. And then there's a part of me and I'm like, well, I always think clearer when I'm walking. I love walking meetings. I love going on a proper walk. I always feel like when I go for a walk, I have the best, my brain gets more oxygen and I get like better ideas. And I'm like, why would I not talk to someone who's so intelligent that I really want to understand as much as possible from a place of like sitting down, right? Like that just, for me, just doesn't work for my body, because I would then have to have a coffee, and it's just not how I even want to operate in the afternoon. So this just feels like the healthiest version for me, but it does take a lot of adjusting, and I know that you as a biohacker would understand.
Yeah, well, I always think of, like, for me at least, walking begets an itch to walk more.
Right?
Yeah. So like if I'm move frequently, and for some reason don't, like I get an itch to move, almost like, okay, I need to be up and doing something.
Yeah,
but that
it's beautiful, right? That we have, when you build those healthy habits, it just becomes, it's almost like with water. Like when I drink a lot of water, I get thirsty, and then a lot of people are like, why are you drinking so much? I'm not thirsty at all. I'm like, the more you drink, the almost like you crave water.
Yeah. Like we kind of train our body, right? And then it lets us know that it needs more of certain things, or maybe less of others, right? So, that's the virtuous loop. When we start to do good things, often we're attracted to do even more good things. And
sorry.
No, and I was just going to say, with aging, unfortunately, like a lot of things, like motivation often starts to dwindle as people get older. Their oomph to move, right? Or you'll even see very old people, right? When you see them move, they look fragile and they move like, I can even see now, like your arms are moving, there's like your whole body is moving, right? And you'll sometimes see an older person move, and it's almost like a statue moving through space, right? Their bodies seems to be conserving energy all over the place.
Yeah, and it's so hard because even me listening to you right now, I feel a little bit almost like scared and overwhelmed, like, oh my God, there's so many processes in my body that are just slowly, deteriorating. And we're going to talk in a second about all the things we can do to just support them, progress a little slower. But I also think with moving and motivation, what you just said, my dad is over 70 and he hasn't been super keen on moving. It was really hard to get him to go for a walk. He's just sitting at home and reading books. And I'm like, I ended up getting them a puppy. And so his motivation to walk he's like walking the dog 6 times a day and just taking him for walks. And it was just so beautiful that it's a lot of times we have nothing to look forward to as we get older. And it's really important to find that something if you don't have grandkids.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden he now started walking, which makes me super happy. But I always say back to my parents, at least 4,000 steps, please, Mom, Dad, you need the oxygen.
Yeah, and often people will do things for pets and grandchildren they wouldn't do normally for themselves. So that's lovely.
Yeah. So let's now understand. Okay, so we know that we have the senescent, one of the senescent cell. Okay, so we have the senescent cells, and they accumulate in our bodies, which kind of make us appear and feel older. What can we do to get rid of them? If we're clearly not getting rid of the yellow leaves of the tree that we are.
Yeah. So I think of, all of us as we're going to act as our own gardeners here, right? So the immune system's trying to do some gardening, but it often needs support. So I guess stepping back a little bit. So senescent cells have been known about for a long time. And it's generally been thought, okay, these things, it has to do, even in the name, like they're aged cells, they're stress cells, they're contributing something. But it's only been about, say, 15 years that scientists really started to figure out the role that they had in unhealthy aging. And one of the cool studies they did is they basically genetically engineered, I think they were mice, but rodents, so that their body would naturally eliminate senescent cells more aggressively. And they noticed that those animals aged slower. They were just healthy, better fur, leaner bodies, much more movement at ages when typically the animals weren't. So all of a sudden it was like, oh, I want to say this was 2009. Like, wow, if we do something about senescent cells, maybe this would help other organisms age better. And then the next kind of big leap forward was around 2015. Some scientists at Mayo Clinic and Scripps Institute of Aging got together and said, okay, well, we kind of understand why senescent cells are sticking on the plant, right? Why they haven't fallen off, right? We got that figured out. Yeah, wonder what would happen if we give compounds that might interrupt some of those processes temporarily. And so they did, and they called compounds that did that Senolytics. And fundamentally what a Senolytic means, it's finally, instead of this stress cell lingering and resisting falling off the plant, we're finally getting it to go through that apoptosis process. But just think of it's finally removing itself. And what apoptosis means, it just breaks apart in little pieces, and then those little pieces are recycled to make new healthy cells. So Senolytics became the term for all the category of compounds that if we get those compounds to a senescent cell, they'll get that cell finally to finish its journey that it started and didn't complete, would be the way I'd think about it.
So how does Senolytics work, and how do you use them?
Yeah.
It sounds like, oh my God, this is such a magical invention. I should have a pill every day.
So I'm going to way oversimplify it, but even this might be some scientific. But think of at any point in a cell, so our cells are born, live lives, and then die, right? So, the life of a cell is going to vary. In your liver, as an example, a cell might live about 1.5 to 2 years. In your heart, a cell might live 4 decades. In your muscles, maybe it's 20 years, right? In our brain, neurons, they live a lifetime, right? So depending on where in the body, cells have different life cycles. And then,
Because there's no, sorry to just interrupt, but there's this theory that we rebuild every 7 years and the exact composition of your cells is something completely different. But what you're saying is actually, yes, some of the cells are rebuilding, but it's not like you're a completely different person.
yeah, so that 7 years is an average of all cells. But some cells, like in your bloodstream, those cells may turn over in 60 days. But, like I said, in your heart, that's 4 decades. Muscles, probably 2 decades. Neurons last forever. We don't want to use up our neurons. And so, but the average is 7. So in a general sense, like when it's natural, like in your liver, that a cell will be born, live, get old, die, and be replaced. And stem cells are what would replace some cells. Cells can also make copies, like daughters of themselves, so to speak, right? And so, a characteristic of a senescent cell is it's not allowed to make new cells, right? It's just frozen, so it's taking up space. And one of the then things that Senolytics do is they're like, okay, why is this cell hanging out? Like, why didn't it go through this final dying off process, right? And the simple way is think of any cell at any given point in time is always inside voting. Like some members are saying, yep, I want to live, I want to hang out. And other people are like, no, we should go through that dying off process. Mm-hmm. And when a cell gets really stressed, ideally it shifts in a way that gets voted like, yeah, let's break apart and be recycled and be put to better use. But senescent cells, the vote is against that. It's like the vote's like, no, we're going to hang out. And so what Senolytics at the most fundamental mechanism do, they shift the votes so that the cell now switches to like, oh, yeah, like it makes sense now to finally go through that dying off process that we've been avoiding for so long so that we can be replaced by something new and healthy. And so they...
Which is using technology to think that you can convince a cell to kill itself in a way, or like let go.
Yeah, but I mean that's really how they're working. They're working on on those decision pathways that often have to do with nutrient sensing and other stress sensing pathways. And so it's just giving compounds that are known to impact those in ways that would cause a stress cell to just say, oh, like I get it. Like I could be put to better use. And like if you think of, I'm sure you know about calorie restriction and intermittent fasting, right? And part of the idea behind, okay, like if we go on a calorie restriction diet, we know that, in many organisms would cause them to live longer. Now, I wouldn't recommend that because it's not great to be hungry all the time either. But part of what's happening is there's the way I would think about it. Our cells, our brain, every part of us is always making predictions, right? So like since you're doing, the walking on this, like your body is going to start to predict, oh, podcasts, I walk during podcasts. And then it's going to get ready to walk even before podcasts, right? It's going to make predictions. And, part of what calorie restriction does is cells would essentially say, oh, it looks like, we're not going to get enough fuel for the near future. I better get rid of things that aren't as necessary. And so the way I think some of especially the plant compounds that act as these convincing compounds for senescent cells is they're changing the environment around the cell, and the cell's saying, oh, the world outside looks more stressful. Let me get rid of the cells that aren't as productive. And senescent cells finally go away, right? So that's a simple way to think about how senolytic compounds work. Now, each one would work somewhat specifically or differently inside cells, but the plant ones like, your fisetin or quercetin or turmeric and milk thistle, these things all seem to work on nutrient sensing pathways.
Oh, beautiful. So would it make sense that if I now know that this is how it works, I should have those Senolytics every single day as much as possible?
So I would say no. And the reason, like going back to our idea of pruning, would it be a great idea to prune a plant every day, do you think? Or should we just prune it periodically?
Exactly. Yeah, right. So it's very common that I think with everything, whether it's diet or fitness or anything in biohacking, we find out that something is really good and then we have it every day, right? Because it's like, oh my God, like even turmeric, it's so good. I'm gonna make a dose turmeric every single day, or I'm gonna have, I don't know, steak is good or it's bad, so I'm gonna have it or not have it. And it's that gold, like, the Goldilocks rule, which
Yep.
is like the right amount is so important. And it's, I think, the hardest one to adopt because we get, like, as humans, we get so excited. I'm guilty of intermittent fasting way too much because I was like, oh my God, it's good for me. So I'm going to keep on going and, less and less. And it got to a point where I was like, wow, there's nowhere to go from there almost. And so what is the right dosage? What's the Goldilocks rule for Senolytics?
Well, the way we approached them at Qualia mirrored what the Mayo researchers did at the get-go. And so what they would have called it something along the lines of hit and run dosing. So from the get-go, the two compounds they used originally together, one was quercetin, but the other was a pretty powerful drug that's often used in certain types of cancers. And so they thought, okay, well, really all we need to do is change the votes. We don't have to change the votes every day. We just need to change the votes once, and the cell will finally decide to go away. So maybe the safest way to do this combination, right, this more risky, heavy-duty medication plus quercetin, is intermittently. And so what they did from the get-go is, okay, well, let's just do this for a couple days and then take a vacation from it for a bit of time. And then we'll do another couple days and then a vacation, right? So that cyclic approach to Senolytics. And so from really the get-go, that was embedded in how Senolytics are used. And it makes sense, right? Because, where we were getting, like, if you pruned a plant every day, you might kill it prematurely instead of making it thrive. And for senescent cells, all we're trying to do is, periodically prune down the numbers. So, and then the other thing, and this is just the way I think about things. So I mentioned that a lot of these senolytic compounds are working on nutrient sensing pathways. And cells sense their environment not that differently than how our ears and eyes sense our environment. So do you know, so I guess stepping back. So the principle of how our vision or hearing works is based on proportional change. So it's not an amount that matters, it's how amounts change, if that makes sense, right? So the analogy I'll often give is if you went to the darkest room or darkest closet in your home right now and lit a candle, you'd notice a big difference, right? Now, imagine if you went in there and there's already 99 candles lit and you light one candle, big whoop, right? Like, who cares, right? Almost no difference, right?
Probably can't even notice.
Right. So one candle doesn't matter. It's the change that causes a response when we're sensing things. And since these plant compounds that we're using in Qualia Senolytic are mostly working on sensing pathways, we want to create a big change. So if you gave the same thing every day, you're doing the 99 candles in a room thing. But if you only periodically do a whole bunch, you're doing much more like the one candle. Cells will notice that change, if that makes sense.
Well, it does, and it's also a little scary because I know there's so many supplements out there that dose quercetin or quercetin on daily basis in mega doses, and I'm just curious if anyone has tested the side effects of that,
Yeah, I mean, I think
or it just becomes not effective over time.
Yeah, I think it depends what we're saying they're effective for. Like quercetin at a moderate dose, if someone had seasonal allergies, that can be helpful. I've seen that, with patients I've worked for, I've seen it in studies. But if we're trying to get rid of senescent cells, we're trying to get them to change their mind. And so I think a bigger signal matters. So if someone's taking, say, quercetin every day, then adding Qualia Senolytic on, you're still going to get a big change compared to normal. But doing the same thing every day, I think you start to, we know with our vision and hearing. So think of hearing as an example. If you live, by a busy freeway or you're in a loud nightclub or restaurant, all the background noise really quickly our brain ignores. But if someone says our name, we'll hear that, right? That's sufficient change, right? So we're always, with things sensing, we're trying to get the thing listening for that signal to pay attention, give it enough signal. And so with Senolytic compounds, it just makes more sense to us at Qualia that it's not a thing you would do every day. It's something that, I do it once a month. For me personally, I take Qualia Senolytic the first weekend of every month. So that's, as we're recording now, that's coming up in a couple days. So
yeah.
And
so what would that's okay. And so how do I know if I'm ready? When it's like, I would say that, some people say like it's better to be preventative, and some people recommend Botox at 20 years old just to be safe. Would you say that there is an age and time where it's too early to start supplementing, or no such thing?
Well, I mean, for Senolytic compounds, I would say yes, right? So, when I think of senescent cells, I think of transient ones and lingering ones. So all of us can make transient ones, like ones that kind of are birthed, do some job, and are gone, days later. Like if I went and ran a marathon, even when I was 20, I would make some senescent cells, right? Because that's really stressful. What happens as we get older is instead of these ones that are made and linger or are transient and are removed, these ones linger and accumulate. So in young people, they don't really have the lingering ones, right? Like that's something that accrues more and more with the passage of time. But I think we want to keep the amount of lingering ones low. So in general, I would say before 35, there wouldn't really be much point to do Senolytic compounds because you probably don't have many lingering ones, maybe so few it's not worth worrying about it. Like it would be a plant that only maybe occasionally got a yellow leaf and it wasn't affecting the plant. By the time, like I'm 62, for listeners, it would be a good bet that I would have a fair amount if I'm not doing things to stay healthy, right? Just the passage of time. And so it would make more sense for someone my age, like to, even if you're not having health problems that we would say, oh, senescent cells are contributing, it would make sense to be a good gardener and prune them away before they get to the point, right? So that one of the ways I think about, healthy aging and getting, to, 100, 120, whatever that number happens to be for someone, right? Like my goal is to get whatever number I get to be able to live my life my way up until as close to the end as possible. And I've seen what happened with my grandparents and with my parents. And I know on average, somewhere about a third of our years after age 60, people spend in deteriorating health of some degree, right? I don't want a third of that time spent in there. And the only way that I believe that can change is not wait till we get to that point and then think, oh, we can magically turn the ship around. It's do more and start it way earlier. And so
would you say that even if someone's I'm 35, would you say that I should also consider supplementing every month, or should I do it maybe every 2 months?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I would say, like maybe quarterly, like almost like when you do a periodic fast might be the best, way to do it. Because, the odds are, given all the good things that you're doing and your age, that you probably don't have many. And what you have is probably, the idea is like a threshold. And threshold effects are important even in allergies, right? We know, like as an example, pollen will cause allergies. And even people that aren't allergic, if we expose them to a massive amount of pollen, most of them would be, right? But as long as something's below a threshold, usually it's manageable. Now, ideally, we want to keep it way below the threshold so we have a good buffer room, right? And so the way I would think about it, like if I was 35 and Qualia Senolytic existed, I would have done it once a quarter. I wouldn't do it once a month. By the time I hit my mid 40s, I would probably say, I want to start making sure I invest doing a lot of good things starting early, because that fourth decade and fifth decade are super important for making sure all decades are, but those ones, if we're not doing things by then to make sure we age gracefully, I think we're going to largely miss the boat.
Wow. What are some of the myths about Senolytics?
I think they're so new, there hasn't been a lot of myths built yet. But and for the listeners, it is a really new area. Remember, I mentioned that Mayo scientists only coined the term in 2015.
2015.
So
Okay. But did you say the study was 2009?
the original one where they genetically modified the animals, they put transgenes in, that was around 2009. The one where they originally gave quercetin and then that other compound together, the compound was called dasatinib. They published that in 2015, so 9 years ago.
Crazy.
And since
That's
then,
nothing in the science world, right?
yeah, so since then it's exploded. But I would say, so one was what we've talked about, right? Like there's senolytic compounds, like we'll just say fisetin. But then to get a senolytic effect, we probably need to give a big enough amount, and we probably want to give it in a more specific way rather than like a lower amount every day, right? So like I've seen, people portray like a really low amount of fisetin as senolytic, and I would say it's a senolytic compound, but it's probably not senolytic in that amount, in that dosing approach. And the analogy I would use, I don't know if this would make sense to you or the listeners, but like we know like saunas can be good, right? To help detox, to keep us healthy.
I just got one today, just arrived.
Oh, awesome. Well, so like sauna, it's heat, right, is what's giving. But if you went into the sauna, instead of it being 140, it was set at 70, it's probably not going to do much good, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So same, like fisetin can be senolytic, but that doesn't mean 100 milligrams is enough, right? The temperature's too low. So myth one would be that idea, right? Like, is something senolytic, but it has to be the right amount. Myth two would be that senescent cells are more of a category than all the same. So different things could cause cells in you to become senescent than me, right? Like our stresses might have been different. Even in you, maybe something caused these things like senescent cells in your liver, but something else caused them in your muscle tissue, right? And so...
Well, that was my next question, actually, because you mentioned that the marathon can cause senescent cells. So I would be curious to understand what are some of the things that create more senescent cells than I would have liked.
Yeah. Oh, well, let me finish this and then we'll get to that. So the second idea would be, think of senescent cells as a category, but the same compound, like quercetin, we already know doesn't impact all senescent cells. It doesn't work in the ones in adipose tissue, or it didn't in one of the original studies, but did work like in endothelial cells. Fisetin in the very first senolytic study did work in fat tissue. So something can be senolytic, but it doesn't mean it's senolytic for senescent cells in all tissues. So you want almost a portfolio of different compounds that can work in multiple tissues. So then getting to your question, all right, so what are some of the things that cause senescent cells? So really just think stress writ large. And again, because this field's so new, I'm sure 10 years from now we'll know a lot more things. But my guess would be most of the things as biohackers we think of as unhealthy things probably cause senescent cells to accumulate faster. And many of the things we think of as healthy things, right, like the hormetic things, probably help make our cells tougher so they don't get as stressed for the same thing. Yeah. But like for skin, like we know too much UV would cause more senescent cells to be made. For like a big one, believe it or not, is a lot of the medications used to treat cancer. So, cancer is a different type of stress cell, but it's a stress cell, right, that our immune system ideally should find. And many of the medications used to treat cancer are trying to cause those cells to basically go through apoptosis, right, to go through like that thing. And they're putting a lot of stress on cells, chemical stress, radiation stress. And so a side effect now that's fairly well established from many treatments for cancer is that you make more senescent cells. So someone that's gone through cancer treatment probably has more than someone at the same age that didn't. Exercise you had asked about. So normal part of exercise, if we exercise enough that we've caused some damage, which we probably want to, right? Because the right amount of damage, not too much damage, but then we build that back stronger. And senescent cells, the transient ones I mentioned, they do good things. Like they call in our immune system to get rid of them, but also the immune system then cleans up, repairs, and rejuvenates as part of that. So what you would classically see in a young animal, if you exercise them hard, they would make some senescent cells, but they would be gone. The immune system would have gotten rid of them really quickly. But what you would see in older animals is they develop what's often called anabolic resistance. And just think of that as meaning the things that cause muscles to grow and become stronger, the anabolic signals. In older mice, older rats, older monkeys, older humans, those things don't work as well. So, like it's harder to put muscle on as a 60 or 70-year-old than it is, at 35, like your age.
Yeah.
A higher protein diet is anabolic, but not as anabolic in an older organism as a younger one. And what they've found in animals is that part of the reason is because of the senescent cells in muscles. And then if those are removed, then that anabolic resistance largely gets mitigated.
Wow. That's extremely powerful. But would you say that if I work out as a young 20, 30-year-old and almost like I practiced removing those cells, that muscle almost, right? Would you say that over time people that have practiced removing the yellow leaves naturally are better when they age at removing them and getting rid of them as they're older? Has there ever been a study done like this?
No, and in part, it's really like to do studies on senescent cells, you have to do tissue biopsies. So there's no like blood test you could do that's going to give like, oh, this is showing changes in senescent cells. So because of that, it takes really specific research. So there's less than we know. There's more that we don't know than that we do know.
I would imagine like it's almost like a muscle that you exercise, that it's like if you're almost forcing your body to have more senescent cells as you're younger and the body is able to get rid of them. I wonder if that makes you then as an older person.
Yeah, I think just like going back, like the ones younger people make are what I put as that transient category, right? We don't really have to worry about those because they're just going to go away. It's these lingering ones that are the ones that come in with aging. And even though they're both called senescent cells, they're just mechanistically very different. Yeah.
Oh, got it. Would it be also unfair to assume that if I have little, like if I supplement or if I take care of myself and take the Senolytics, can I delay my menopause, for example, or extend my fertility because all of a sudden that's all connected to mitochondria and there would be some sort of connection with extending fertility for women?
It's a great question. So there's a few animal studies that have looked at what I would think of as ovarian aging and senescent cells and Senolytics. And there's
other like cells in our ovaries that make our ovaries age?
Yeah, I mean, for sure there are. And inflammation, and stress tend to make everything wear out unevenly, right? So we know that just from a long history of biomedical sciences. So, but there hasn't been much studied there to date. But one interesting thing, and think of this as pure anecdote, right? So take it for that. But
disclaimer.
Yes, that disclaimer. But I was told about 2 months ago by our head of customer service at Qualia that she'd had 5 different women plus herself that had all started menstruating again after doing Qualia Senolytic for a bit of time. So
at what age?
So these were people that had relatively recently gone into menopause and stopped menstruating, and then somehow all started again. So she was asking me what should I tell them about this? It's like, well, just keep gathering the information. Like no one's looking at that in animals or humans. So, but it would seem like there was a rejuvenation that might have happened for those particular individuals in that system.
How excited are you to be working for a company that's just at the forefront? And it feels like the feedback of your customers can give you almost like a better scope. It's like live research, right?
Yeah, and it's now like the classic thing in medicine is the double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled studies. But I read a lot of research, and what's interesting is, through like the early 1970s, what was much more common in medicine and in journals would have been like, well, let's just look at 60 different people and, like just do a series of what I would think of as N of 1 experiments and see what happens. And then we write all of those up together, right? And that has, fallen out of medicine, but that spirit's still live in the biohacking community, which is super cool.
Yeah. So how did you even come about creating, a supplement that can support people in their aging journey? Like, how did you, what's your personal story?
Oh, so yeah, so my, so I'm the formulator, head of product development at Qualia. And, so part of my job is to be a nerd and read studies and stay abreast of things that I'm interested in and that biohackers are interested in. And somewhere around 2017 was when Fisetin, that animal study on Fisetin being a Senolytic came out. And around that time, I'm like, well, this is interesting, right? Like quercetin, Fisetin, these are things that are, naturopaths like me have used for a while, like that these are Senolytic in animals when used in, high amounts and short periods of time. That's cool. Like I should learn more about this new and emerging thing. So I did. And part of like my brain's always been like biased towards like, what can we do to like drastically make someone healthier? And these animals, the Senolytic compounds in these original studies did. So it's like, oh, this is super interesting. And then I think it was the fall of 2019. So just the like fall before COVID, I went to Spain for a 2-week vacation, and I can't just like sit at coffee shops and go to the beach all day. And so I just brought a bunch that I wanted to read in this actual area, senescent cells and Senolytics. And just did that over coffee, most mornings for an hour or two before I chilled for the day. And when I came back from that, I'm like, we can make a product, I think, that would really help people in this area, because there's more than just these two things. There's something called piperlongamine, the isoflavones in soy seem to do some really cool things on these same pathways. And that by stacking these different things together, we might be able to make something that meaningfully helps people. And so, so then around beginning of 2020, I was talking to our CSO, our chief science officer and head of marketing. I'm like, we should do this. And like, well, why should we do it? And I said, well, I want to take it. And they're like, that's not like, you're not, going to buy a whole bunch. Like, will other people buy this? I'm like, probably not. Like maybe some biohackers will be into it, maybe some longevity docs, but it's I think 10 years from now, people are going to think this is super cool, and we could be one of the early leaders in this. So, be really good.
You already are, obviously, and I think it was just like the biggest journey, I think, for you as a company is to like educate people. Because when I first saw you guys at the biohacking conference, I was like, wait, what is it? Wait, I don't take it every day. I take it at least once a month, and maybe longer. I was like, wow, this is such a unique formula. So I really like that you took the time, and I think your packaging is one of the most interesting packaging. So this is an example of like, wow, you managed to explain science on a tiny little piece of paper so you understand why to the people, which is not easy. And I think that's what makes it super innovative, that like every time you're on the forefront, it's a little bit less crowded at the beginning, but I think these conversations are super helpful, because once you understand why, it's hard not to be a fan.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, like many things that catch on in the biohacker space, things that people feel and experience and notice a difference, then like, I want more of this. Or things that from a science perspective, they make sense. Like, oh, I'm going to have more of these as I get older. Doing things to have less of them in advance, so there's less damage. That makes sense, right?
Yeah. What's your favorite ingredient in the formula?
So I'm not sure I have a favorite, but I know the piperlongamine that we have. So that's in there's black pepper. Most people know of that, and black pepper has I almost think of it as like a sibling plant that's called long pepper. Both were used in a lot of traditional medicine systems. And long pepper used to be used as a spice, just like black pepper is now, and just kind of outside of India and a few other places fell out of the way. But one of the differences in those two plants is black pepper doesn't have this compound called piperlongamine, but long pepper does. Like that's where the long and piperlongamine comes from. And no one was making an extract for that was potent. And so that maybe is my favorite because we were the first ones that, created an extract that, gives a meaningful amount of that compound. But
So your product, oh, sorry.
oh
Go
no,
ahead.
before that, like on, sometimes on forums, people will be like, well, what if I just like eat a whole bunch of long pepper or like, how do I get this? So we help solve that. So, which,
Yeah. Oh wow, that's I love and it comes back to like so many things that used to be eaten by our ancestors that kind of like are no longer part of the, we no longer enjoy the benefits because they're not as popular. So what does it mean that your product is clinically tested?
yeah. So one of the things we do at Qualia is because we make complicated products, so we don't really make things where like, oh, we'll just put one or two ingredients together and sell those, right? Because there's lots of people that do
You
that.
should see your brain,
Yeah.
nootropic.
Yeah. Qualia Mind has the 32 ingredients in the new formula.
It's insane. It's like a little book in the back.
Yep. And so because of that, one of the things we always do before we ever sell a product is we make the recipe, and then I'll take it. Some other people on our team will take it. And then we'll make more, and we'll do what we think of as a pilot study. So this means we'll have people take it anywhere for a couple weeks, like Qualia Mind for 2 weeks. The Senolytic, it was a month. And then like see how they do. And so what we did with Qualia Senolytic before we sold it, we did a 5-week study. And what we had, people do Qualia Senolytic for 2 days, take 12 days off. Do it 2 more days, take 12 days off, and then do 2 final days, right? So they did it basically 6 days over 5 weeks. And we measured how their, joints did, how their, movement, things like that, flexibility, and all those areas improved a lot. So at the time, we're like, okay, this looks like it's doing what it's supposed to do. Let's start selling it. And then once we were selling it, we decided to do what's thought of as a placebo-controlled study, right? So when we say clinically tested, we mean we've done the placebo study on it. And that in that study, it was better than placebo was.
Wow, that must be so satisfying.
It's nice when things work.
Yeah. Well, because it's nice in theory. Like in theory, it should be amazing, but when you actually see that it does work, it must be super satisfying. I love you. I see your book right behind you.
Oh, yeah.
Right above your head, Shapeshift. What's next for you, for the company? And, what can we expect? What are you working on right now?
So a few things. One, we're just about to do a new and improved Qualia Mind that comes out. I'm not sure when this will air. So it'll be for sale, I think, August 17th. So maybe this will air before then.
Yeah.
We've done what I think is the best magnesium product on the market that's going to be launching in October. And so that one I'm excited about. Magnesium, I know biohackers love it and it's a popular supplement, but magnesium, even though a lot of people use it, it's still probably underrated. It's just, a super important mineral. And then we've just moved into testing what I think of as an inflammation product for like joints, low back pain, things like that. That would be really, really distinctive. And, a few well-known biohackers, we consulted with and got their thoughts on that product during the formulation. Wow. So that one's just going into our that pilot phase of like doing a study on that starting next week. We've also are putting an Akkermansia as a probiotic together with some other things that will be building the prototypes in our lab sometime within about 2 weeks and put into testing by the end of the month, early September. So those are the things that all the research is done. Now we're at that stage of like, does it actually work? So
wow. It makes me so happy and so good. Thank you for all the work that you're doing and just keep coming up with even more formulas that are actually are full of the products. I feel like the supplement space is such a interesting, unregulated space still, and a lot of supplements have nothing inside really. And a lot of people get disheartened because they feel like, well, why am I spending money if there's nothing inside or there's 5% of what they're saying? So it's nice to have companies that actually, put effort and make sure that this is good quality. And and thank you.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
for doing that. And thank you for sharing the science behind the products. Where can we find you? Where can we find if we
Yeah.
were to Qualia, like where do I start?
Yeah.
Please tell us.
So our website is Qualia Life, so QualiaLife.com. Our main social media is Instagram by far. We do a lot of things on Instagram, quotes and images and things to just educate, really. Any of my blogs that I put, for Qualia Senolytic, for listeners, there'd be a long blog post on our website that's going to share everything about, what a Senolytic is, why each ingredient is in it, why the amount that I put in is in it. We try to be really transparent with the world about, the decisions we make and why we made them. The same, any of the studies I mentioned, those are all going to be on our website. And then on X, we don't have as much following, but X, I'm actually, I post on X once in a while for the Qualia.
Okay.
So.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the conversation, Dr. Kelly. And if you guys want to check out the product, you can use the code Aggie for a discount, which is always worth it to use. Thank you for your time, and I can't wait to speak more in the future.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today, Aggie.
Thank you.